At my wedding reception, my father-in-law sat at the head table in an old, worn suit. It was one of the nicest days of my life, but I remember looking at him and feeling embarrassed. I know that sounds terrible to say out loud, but it's the truth. He didn't have the commanding presence of the other fathers in the room. He wasn't the CEO of some big company. He wasn't the successful businessman everyone could point to and respect. He was just there, quiet, in the background. My mother-in-law did most of the talking. My family whispered about him that night. "What does he do for work?" my aunt asked. And my mom didn't have a good answer. Nobody really did. Everyone just knew him as the quiet dad, the retired guy who fixed things in the garage, the man who didn't say much at family dinners. 23 years of marriage later, I was sitting in my kitchen at 6 in the morning, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at a black and gold envelope that had just arrived in the mail. My hands were shaking. Inside that envelope was an invitation to something called the Distinguished Service Medal Ceremony at the Pentagon, and my husband's father's name was listed as the guest of honor. I read it 3 times. Then I read it again. Because what I was reading didn't match the man I had known my entire adult life. What I was about to discover would expose a lie so massive, so carefully hidden, that it would destroy every single relationship in our family. And it would all come down to a secret my father-in-law had kept for decades. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this story really began. His name was Robert, but everyone called him Bob. I met him for the first time in 1999 when I was introduced to my boyfriend's family. My boyfriend Michael had warned me about his father ahead of time. He said his dad was quiet and kind of kept to himself. I thought that meant maybe he was shy. I didn't realize it meant something else entirely. We pulled into their driveway on a Saturday afternoon. The house was modest, a 3-bedroom ranch with a detached garage. The lawn was well maintained, but nothing fancy. Nothing that screamed, "Successful person lives here." Bob was in the garage when we arrived. He was working on something under a car. I couldn't see what at first. His wife, Patricia, came out and greeted us warmly. She was the opposite of Bob in every way. Loud, social, always had something to say about someone. But she was also warm and welcoming. "Bobby," she called out to him. "Come meet Michael's girlfriend." He crawled out from under the car. I remember noticing he had grease all over his hands and his old t-shirt. He wiped his hands on an even greasier rag and extended one to shake my hand. "Nice to meet you," he said simply. That was it. 4 words. Then he went back to the garage. Over the next few years, I learned that this was just how Bob was. He wasn't unfriendly. He wasn't mean. He was just quiet, absent, even when he was present. Michael's mother did all the talking. She talked about her job in real estate. She talked about her accomplishments. She talked about Michael's brother David, who was becoming a lawyer. She talked about all their vacations and their friends and their book club. Bob rarely contributed to these conversations. When he did speak, it was usually something practical. "The fence needs fixing. The hot water heater's acting up. I'll handle it." And he did handle it. Everything. The house, the yard, the cars. If something needed fixing, Bob fixed it. My family started to see him as a failure, honestly. My mother would say things like, "It's so sad. He had so much potential." My father would shake his head and say, "I don't understand how a man can just not want to do anything with his life." My brother said the worst thing. "I feel bad for Michael. His dad never amounted to anything." And the thing is, Bob never corrected anyone. When people asked him what he did for work, he'd say, "Oh, I'm retired now. Worked in government for a long time. Nothing glamorous." Government work. That's what he always said. And everyone in the family interpreted that as low-level government job. Maybe something at the post office. Maybe the DMV. Something boring. Something ordinary. Michael had picked up on the energy too. He was embarrassed by his father. I could tell. He'd invite me to family events, but he'd warn me first. My dad might be quiet, he'd say. He's not very impressive. My father-in-law never seemed bothered by any of this. He'd show up to family dinners. He'd listen to everyone's stories. He'd eat whatever Patricia cooked. And then he'd excuse himself to read the newspaper or work on something in the garage. It was like he had accepted his place as the quiet, unsuccessful guy. The man who never became anything special. I felt sorry for him, honestly. I thought he was lonely. But I was wrong about so many things. The disrespect started slowly. At first, it was just little things. Patricia would contradict him in front of people. He'd say something and she'd roll her eyes and correct him. "That's not how it happened, Bobby. You always get the details wrong." He'd just nod. He wouldn't argue. He'd just accept the correction and move on. Then it got worse. Michael's brother David had become a successful lawyer, and suddenly, every family dinner became a celebration of David's accomplishments. We'd hear about his cases, his big wins, his prestigious firm, his impressive salary, and Bob would just sit there, quietly eating. One time, and I remember this specifically because I felt a flash of anger in the moment, David was talking about winning a big court case. He was bragging about how he'd outsmarted his opponent with some legal strategy. Patricia said, "That's so impressive, David. So much smarter than just, well, working with your hands." Everyone at the table laughed. It was a joke at Bob's expense. A joke about the fact that he worked on cars and fixed things in the garage. The implication was clear. Manual labor was beneath intellectual work. Working with your hands meant you weren't smart enough for real success. And Bob? He just smiled a little and took another bite of his dinner. That bothered me more than it probably should have. There was something about the way he accepted the disrespect that made me want to scream. But I didn't. I was a guest in his house. I was married to his son. And honestly, at that point, I believed what everyone else believed. That he was just a quiet, unsuccessful guy who had made peace with his ordinary life. The disrespect escalated when Michael and I bought our house. We were so excited. We'd saved up for years for a down payment. We found a beautiful colonial in a nice neighborhood. It was the biggest investment we'd ever made. We invited Bob and Patricia over to see it. I wanted Bob to see it especially, because I knew he appreciated a well-built house. He was the kind of guy who'd notice the craftsmanship, the way the floors were laid, the quality of the woodwork. He walked through every room carefully. He went to the basement. He checked the foundation. He went up to the attic. He spent probably 30 minutes examining the house in detail. When he came back downstairs, I asked him what he thought. "It's a solid house," he said. "Good bones. You got a good deal." Coming from Bob, that was a pretty significant compliment. I was genuinely pleased. But then Patricia walked in, and she said loudly, "Well, I suppose it's nice, but it's not like David's house. David's house is actually in an exclusive neighborhood. This is just suburban." Michael looked at me and shrugged, embarrassed. And Bob said nothing. That was the pattern. Bob would be kind, thoughtful, present in subtle ways, and Patricia would belittle him, or other family members would forget about him, or they'd make jokes that highlighted how little he'd accomplished. By the time I was in my late 30s, I had completely accepted the narrative about Bob. He was a nice man who hadn't made much of himself. He was content to live in the shadows while his wife and his successful son got the attention. I felt bad for him sometimes, but mostly, I just accepted it as a fact of life. That's what makes what happened next so shocking. Because there were little signs that I missed. Signs that should have clued me in that something was different about Bob. When we'd have family discussions about national news, Bob would sometimes make an observation that was so insightful, so knowledgeable, that everyone would stop and listen. Then Patricia would say something to move the conversation along, and Bob would go back to being quiet. When I'd mentioned that something in our house was malfunctioning, the electrical system, a plumbing issue, Bob would know exactly what the problem was. Not just know. He'd know the history of similar issues, the codes that applied, the best way to fix it. It was like he had a vast technical knowledge that went way beyond just fixing cars and patios. One time, Michael and I were having an argument about whether I should go back to work or stay home with the kids. I asked Bob what he thought, really thought, about mothers working versus staying home. He gave me an answer that was so thoughtful, so nuanced, that I remembered it for years. He talked about the value of choice, about how women should have the freedom to decide what was best for their families without judgment. He talked about sacrifice and strength in ways that suggested he'd thought deeply about these things, about life, about what really mattered. But it was just one answer on one afternoon, and then he went back to the garage. I should have paid more attention to these moments. I should have realized that they didn't match the narrative we'd all accepted about him. But I didn't. I was too caught up in my own life, too busy with my kids and my career and my marriage, too blind to see what was right in front of me. It started with a phone call. Michael's mother, Patricia, called me one afternoon while I was at work. She was frantic, panicked, which was unlike her. Patricia was usually calm and collected, even when things were chaotic. "You need to come get Bob," she said immediately. "What? Why? What happened?" My first thought was that he'd had a heart attack or a stroke or something. "He got a letter from the Pentagon. I don't know what it says, but he's acting very strange. He won't talk to me. He just went into the garage and he's been out there for hours." My heart was racing. "Patricia, is he okay? Is he sick?" "I don't know," she said, frustration creeping into her voice. "He won't tell me anything. He just keeps saying it's nothing, but clearly something is wrong. Can you come over? Maybe he'll talk to you." I told my boss I had to leave. I didn't know what was happening, but something in Patricia's voice made me feel like this was serious. I drove to their house. It was a 30-minute drive. The whole way there, I was thinking about what could be in a letter from the Pentagon. I had no idea. It didn't make sense in the context of anything I knew about Bob. When I arrived, Patricia was waiting on the porch. She looked genuinely worried. "He's in the garage," she said. "He won't come inside, won't eat, won't talk about it." I went to the garage. Bob was sitting on a stool next to his workbench. There was an open letter on the bench next to him. The envelope was official-looking, dark blue, gold lettering. "Bob?" I said gently. He looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Not sadness exactly, more like resignation. Like he knew something was about to happen that he couldn't stop. "Hi," he said simply. "Patricia's worried about you. What's wrong?" He picked up the letter. He looked at it for a moment, then he handed it to me. "You should probably read this," he said, "because it's about to become everyone's business." I opened the letter. It was from the Department of Defense. It was an official invitation to a ceremony. The ceremony was for the presentation of a Distinguished Service Medal, and it was in Bob's name. I read the letter slowly, multiple times. I was trying to understand how this made sense. A Distinguished Service Medal is not a small thing. It's a major military honor. It's given to people who have done extraordinary things while serving their country. "Bob, what is this?" I asked. And that's when he told me. Everything. He told me that he had retired from the Army 30 years ago. Not just the Army. He told me he'd been a general, a 2-star general, an officer who had spent his entire career in military intelligence and strategic operations. He told me that the reason he'd never talked about it was because when you retire from that kind of position, there are certain rules, certain confidentiality agreements, certain ways you're supposed to behave. He told me that he was entitled to a pension that was significantly more than Michael's mother had ever realized, that they'd lived modestly by choice, not by necessity, that he'd wanted to build a life where he was known for who he was, not for his title. He told me that the Distinguished Service Medal ceremony was being held because recent activities, things that had happened in his previous career, were finally being declassified, and they wanted to publicly honor him for his contributions. "Does Michael know?" I asked. "No," he said. "I was planning to wait until after the ceremony. I didn't want to make a big deal about it. But the letter came here, and Patricia opened it, and now I guess there's no point in waiting. I was stunned. I couldn't even process what I was hearing. This quiet man who my family thought was a failure. This man who'd been disrespected and dismissed at every family gathering. This man was a general. He had served his country in intelligence and strategic operations. He had been honored with military medals, and nobody knew. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" I asked. He looked away. "Because I wanted people to know me as Bob, not as General Robert Henderson. Just Bob. A husband, a father, a man who fixes things and reads the newspaper and doesn't make a big fuss." "But your family," I said, "the way they treat you, the things they say." "I know," he said quietly. "And I made peace with it a long time ago. What other people think of you doesn't have to define you. I knew who I was. I knew what I'd done. I didn't need validation from my family." "Michael deserves to know," I said. "Your grandchildren deserve to know." He nodded slowly. "I know. I was going to tell him. But not like this. Not like some scandal that gets exposed." Dramatic pause. But it was too late for that. Because Patricia was already on the phone. Patricia called Michael. She called David. She called their other relatives. She called my mother because apparently she and my mom were close enough to discuss family secrets. Within an hour, I was getting phone calls from people I hadn't talked to in years. "Did you know?" my mother asked when she called me. "I just found out," I said. "Today." "A general? A 2-star general and nobody told us?" The thing about Patricia is that she doesn't understand subtlety. She saw the letter. She saw the Pentagon seal. She saw the recognition. And suddenly, the man she'd been belittling and disrespecting for 30 years was not what she thought he was. Instead of feeling embarrassed, instead of feeling ashamed, she immediately started spinning the narrative. By the time Michael got to his parents' house, Patricia had already reframed the entire situation. She wasn't a woman who'd been married to a successful man and didn't know it. She was a woman who'd been kept in the dark. She was a victim of his secrecy. She was a woman who'd been deceived. I was there when Michael arrived. He came straight into the garage, and he looked at his father with confusion and anger and something else I couldn't quite name. "Is this true?" he asked. Bob nodded. "Yes." "You're a general?" "I was. I've been retired for 30 years. Michael's face was red. I could see him processing. Not just the information, but the implications. All those years of thinking his father was unsuccessful. All those times he'd been embarrassed by him. All those times his father had been silent while people disrespected him. "Why didn't you tell me?" Michael asked. "Because I didn't want it to matter," Bob said. "I didn't want my children to love me because of my rank or my accomplishments. I wanted them to love me as their father." "That's not fair," Michael said, and his voice was shaking with emotion. "Do you know what I've said about you? Do you know what I've thought?" Bob looked at his son, and I saw genuine pain in his expression. "I know," he said softly. Michael walked out, just turned around and walked out of the garage. Patricia, meanwhile, was furious. Not at herself, not for the way she'd treated him, but at him for having kept the secret. "How could you?" she screamed at Bob when Michael left. "How could you humiliate me like this? All those years I told people my husband was retired. People asked what you did and I made excuses for you. I protected you." "You didn't have to protect me," Bob said calmly. "I chose not to talk about it. You chose to make me look foolish." And that was what really bothered her. Not his honor, not his service, not his integrity. What bothered her was that she'd been made to look foolish, that she'd made excuses for a man who didn't need excuses. That night, I went home to my own house. Michael didn't come with me. He needed space to process. I called him every hour to check on him, but he didn't want to talk. Over the next few days, the situation got worse. David called Bob and wanted to know why he'd never mentioned his military service, as if his father owed him that information. as if the fact that his father had been decorated and honored somehow diminished David's own accomplishments. David's wife got involved. She called me and said, "This is so typical of Bob. Everything is always about being secretive and mysterious. Why can't he just be normal?" Even my mother said something that infuriated me. She said, "Well, of course he kept it secret. Men like that always do. They want to seem humble, but really they're just attention-seeking in a different way." I wanted to scream at all of them. Because what I was seeing was this: a man who had lived a life of genuine service and humility, and a family that was so caught up in their own egos and insecurities that they couldn't even celebrate his accomplishments. Instead, they were making it about themselves. Patricia started calling people and reframing the narrative. She told people that Bob had lied to her, that he'd hidden his career from her, that she'd been deceived. She made it sound like he'd done something wrong by choosing not to talk about the Vietnam War, military intelligence operations, and classified government work. She made it sound like his silence was a betrayal. And the worst part? Nobody questioned her version of events. Nobody thought to ask why a man might want to keep his classified military career private. Nobody considered that maybe, just maybe, Bob had good reasons for what he chose to share and what he chose to keep to himself. Instead, everyone sided with Patricia. Michael was caught in the middle. He was angry at his father for not telling him. But he was also starting to realize that he'd been unfair to his father. That all those years of thinking of him as unsuccessful had been based on a lie. A lie that Bob had never actually told. The Pentagon ceremony was in 3 weeks, and by that point, the question wasn't whether to celebrate Bob's honor. The question was whether anyone in his family would show up at all. A week before the ceremony, Bob called Michael and asked if we could come over. Michael hesitated, but he agreed. When we got there, Bob had prepared something. A video. Old military footage from Bob's career. Nothing classified. Things that had finally been declassified and could be shared. I watched as my quiet father-in-law appeared on screen in military uniform, addressing rooms full of generals and government officials. He was commanding, confident, articulate. He spoke about strategy and intelligence operations in ways that made clear he was respected at the highest levels. There were photographs, images of Bob receiving honors from presidents, shaking hands with world leaders, presenting briefings to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There were commendations, formal letters recognizing his work in military intelligence, his contributions to national security, his leadership during critical operations. And there were personal letters from other military officers, from government officials, all expressing gratitude for his service and his sacrifice. Michael watched it all in silence. His face was changing as he watched. The anger was giving way to something else. Understanding, maybe. Or shame. After the video ended, Bob told us stories. About his career. About why he'd never talked about it. He told us that during the Vietnam War, he'd been involved in intelligence operations that had saved American lives. But those operations involved classified information that he couldn't discuss. And when he came home from Vietnam, he didn't want to relive it. He didn't want to be defined by it. He told us that he'd spent his career trying to protect his family from the weight of that work. The things he'd seen, the decisions he'd made. He didn't want his children growing up with a father who was known for military operations. He wanted to be known for being present, for being a good husband and father. "I wanted my legacy to be that I was a man you could trust," he told Michael. "A man who fixed things. A man who was there for you. Not a man defined by war and intelligence operations." Michael had tears in his eyes. "I thought you were a failure," Michael said quietly. "I know," Bob said. "I was ashamed of you." "I know that too." "How did you stand it?" Michael asked. "All those years, knowing what you'd accomplished, knowing what you'd done, and letting everyone think." "Because," Bob said, "what I accomplished doesn't matter if I fail at being a father and a husband. I made a choice a long time ago. I chose my family over my ego. And I've never regretted that choice. Not once." Michael broke down. We both did. Because we finally understood. This wasn't about a secret. This was about a man who had been given the choice between personal glory and family loyalty, and he'd chosen family. That day, Michael finally apologized, and Bob forgave him immediately, as if there was nothing to forgive. But there was one person who wouldn't forgive. One person who still saw Bob's revelation as a personal betrayal. Patricia. The ceremony at the Pentagon was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. It was formal, official, conducted by the Department of Defense. Michael and I were going. After our conversation with Bob, Michael felt like he needed to be there. He needed to publicly support his father. But the rest of the family was fractured. David wasn't coming. Patricia wasn't coming. Bob's extended family wasn't coming. The only people showing up were Michael, me, and our 2 children. I felt angry about that. I felt like the family was missing an opportunity to celebrate a man who had done extraordinary things. But Bob didn't seem bothered. It doesn't matter, he told me the night before. I did this work because it needed to be done, not for recognition. We arrived at the Pentagon early. I'd never been inside the building before. It's massive, imposing. There were security checkpoints and official-looking people everywhere. Bob was there in his dress uniform. I'd never seen him in uniform before, and he looked completely different. He stood taller. There was a confidence about him that had always been there, but it was more visible somehow when he was wearing the physical markers of his achievement. The ceremony took place in an official Pentagon auditorium. There were high-ranking military officers present. There were government officials. There was a photographer and a videographer. And there was Bob's family, Michael, me, our kids, sitting in the front row, taking it all in. The ceremony began with remarks from a general, Bob's former superior. This general talked about Bob's contributions to military intelligence. He spoke about specific operations that were now declassified. He talked about how Bob's work had directly resulted in the protection of American lives. The general said something that struck me deeply. He said, General Henderson could have pursued a higher rank. He could have gone all the way to 3-star or beyond. But he chose to step away from the career track because his family needed him. That took more integrity than climbing the military hierarchy ever could. When the Distinguished Service Medal was presented, the entire room stood and applauded. Michael stood too. He was crying. He stood and applauded his father, and I could see that he finally understood. His father had sacrificed his potential career advancement for his family. He had chosen to be present, to be humble, to be loved for who he was, not what he'd accomplished. After the ceremony, there was a reception. Military officers approached Bob and told him their own stories about how his work had affected them. A woman who was a colonel told Bob that his intelligence briefings had probably saved her life during a deployment. A government official told Bob that his strategic analysis had influenced policy decisions that had protected American interests. Everyone wanted to shake his hand, to thank him, to recognize him, and Bob accepted it all graciously. But after about an hour, he asked if we could leave. "I've done my duty," he told me. "I don't need the rest." On the drive home, Michael asked his father if he was upset about the family not being there. "No," Bob said. "I gave them the choice, and they made it. That's their choice to make. All I can do is live my own life with integrity." Michael nodded, understanding. But I was still angry, because I knew that Patricia was going to try to spin this somehow. She was going to try to make herself the victim in this story. And I was right. The next day, Patricia called me. "I want to know everything," she said. "I want to know about the ceremony. I want details." I almost hung up on her, but I told her what happened. I told her about the military officers, about the speeches, about the recognition. "I can't believe he did that without me," she said. And she said it like she was the victim, like Bob had deliberately excluded her. "You chose not to come," I said flatly. "Because he didn't invite me. He didn't ask me to be there." "He assumed you'd want to support your husband," I said. It apparently didn't occur to him that you'd be angry at him for accomplishments he'd kept private. There was silence on the other end of the line. "You don't understand," Patricia said. "I have been a good wife to that man, and he repaid me by humiliating me." "He didn't humiliate you," I said. "He made a choice about his privacy. That's not humiliation." But I could tell from her tone that she wasn't going to accept that. She was building a narrative in her mind. Bob had wronged her. Bob had kept secrets from her. Bob had made her look foolish. And now she was the victim. Over the next few weeks, I watched as Patricia rewrote history. She told people that Bob had deliberately hidden his successful career to make her feel bad about her own accomplishments. She told people that he had lied to her about his income, that he'd pretended to be less wealthy than he actually was. None of it was true, but the damage was done. Michael tried to talk to his mother about it. He tried to explain that his father had been honest about everything, that his father had simply chosen not to talk about his classified military career, that there was nothing wrong with that. But Patricia wouldn't listen. David, meanwhile, had a different reaction. He reached out to his father and apologized. He said he felt like he'd wasted years being ashamed of his father when he should have been proud. Bob forgave him immediately, and David actually meant his apology. He started asking his father questions about his career. He became interested in the stories his father had kept private. It was healing in a way, but Patricia couldn't let it go. About 2 months after the ceremony, Patricia demanded that Bob sign over more of his military pension to her. She said she deserved it because she'd sacrificed so much to support him during his hidden military career. Bob refused. He said his pension was allocated fairly according to their marital agreement, and he wasn't going to renegotiate it based on her feelings about his previous career. Patricia threatened divorce. That was the final straw for Bob. He told me later that he realized Patricia wasn't upset about his secret career. She was upset that she couldn't use it to control him. She'd spent 30 years thinking she was the more successful one, and suddenly that narrative didn't work anymore, and she couldn't handle it. So Bob made a decision. He told Michael that he was moving out. The day Bob moved out, Michael asked if he could help him pack. Patricia was at her book club. Bob wanted it that way. I went with Michael to help, and while we were packing up Bob's belongings, he told us the full story, the real story, the one that Patricia would never understand. He told us that he'd met Patricia when he was finishing his military service. She'd been beautiful and confident and everything he thought he wanted. But even early in their relationship, she'd wanted him to be something he wasn't. She wanted him to be impressive, to be successful in obvious ways, to be someone she could brag about. But Bob had come back from Vietnam broken, in ways he couldn't explain. He'd seen things that had changed him, and what he needed was a partner who could accept him, who could love him as he was, who didn't need him to be a powerful general with an impressive title. So he retired. He stepped away from the military career track. He built a life where he could be quiet, where he could be himself, and Patricia resented him for it, silently, patiently, for 30 years. She resented him because he wasn't the impressive success story she'd wanted to marry. She made jokes about him. She belittled him in front of family. She made him feel small. And Bob had let it happen because he thought that's what love meant. Sacrifice. Letting someone diminish you because you loved them. But after the Pentagon ceremony, after his accomplishments were finally brought into the light, Patricia couldn't hide her resentment anymore. She couldn't pretend she'd been a supportive wife to a man she was ashamed of. Because the truth was more complicated than that. The truth was that she'd married a man she thought would be a certain kind of success. And when he turned out to be a different kind of success, a quiet, humble kind of success, she felt like he'd lied to her. But he hadn't lied. He'd just lived. And she couldn't forgive him for choosing a life that didn't center around her validation. "I stayed with her for 30 years because I thought that was the right thing to do," Bob told Michael. "Because I thought if I was patient enough, if I was good enough, eventually she'd understand why I made the choices I made. She'd see that I chose her and our family over my career. She'd appreciate that." He shook his head sadly. But people don't work that way. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for evidence that contradicts their assumptions. And when that evidence finally comes, instead of changing their mind, they just get angry. Michael hugged his father, and I could see that Michael was finally understanding what true sacrifice looked like. It wasn't about grand gestures. It was about choosing someone else's welfare over your own ego, year after year, with no guarantee of appreciation. It was about loving someone who didn't fully see you. Bob moved into a small apartment across town. It was modest, quiet, everything he'd ever wanted. And for the first time in 30 years, he seemed at peace. It's been 3 years now since the Pentagon ceremony, and the family situation is different than I would have predicted. Michael and his father are closer than they've ever been. Michael visits his father every week. They talk about military history. Bob has even started consulting for a think tank, using his expertise to advise on policy issues. Michael is proud of his father, genuinely proud. Not because Bob made a grand gesture, but because Michael finally sees who his father always was. David and his father also have a strong relationship now. David brings his kids to visit their grandfather. He tells his children stories about their grandfather's service. He's using his father's example to teach his own children about integrity and sacrifice. Patricia and Bob are still married, technically, but they live separate lives. Patricia lives in the family home. Bob lives in his apartment. They speak occasionally, but it's cordial and distant. I asked Bob once if he regretted staying with her for so long, if he wished he'd made different choices earlier. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know if I regret it. I think I made the best choice I could with the information I had at the time. But what I've learned is that sometimes loving someone means accepting that they won't love you back. And that has to be okay. You can't let someone else's inability to see you become the definition of who you are." Patricia has since gotten involved with a new social circle. She's dating a man who is impressed by her accomplishments. She's become happier, in a way, lighter, less burdened by the weight of her disappointment in Bob. And Bob? Bob is happy. He works. He sees his family. He has friends. He goes on the occasional adventure. He lives the quiet life he always wanted. But now, there's no shame in it. There's no one telling him he should be more impressive, no one belittling him for his choices, just the freedom to be who he actually is. Michael brought his children to visit their grandfather last week. His daughter asked Bob if he was sad that his family had been so disrespectful to him for so long. Bob told her something that I'll never forget. He said, "No, because sadness is about wishing things were different, and I can't change what happened. But I can understand it, and understanding helps. It doesn't make the pain go away, but it makes it mean something." I've thought a lot about this story over the past 3 years, about what it means, about what it says about family and secrets and pride and love. And I think the moral is this: we all make assumptions about people. We look at someone and we decide who they are based on the information we have, and then we treat them accordingly. We respect them or we disrespect them. We're proud of them or we're ashamed of them. But we're almost always wrong, because people are more complex than what's visible on the surface. People have inner lives and sacrifices and accomplishments that nobody knows about. People make choices that make sense only to them, based on values that other people might not share. And the respect we owe to each other isn't based on how impressive someone is. It's based on recognizing that every person is living their own complex story. Every person is doing their best. Every person deserves basic human dignity. Bob never asked for recognition. He never needed his family to see how impressive he was. What he deserved, what he needed, was for his family to respect his choices, to understand that his decision to step away from a high-powered military career wasn't a failure. It was a sacrifice made in love. And the tragedy of this story isn't that his family found out he was a general. The tragedy is that his family spent 30 years disrespecting a man who had chosen them over his own success. If Patricia had been able to see that, if David had been able to understand that, if Michael had recognized the value of his father's sacrifice earlier, then maybe things would have been different. Maybe Bob wouldn't have had to move out. Maybe the family would still be whole. But that's the thing about love, about family. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who hurt us most deeply, not maliciously, but through indifference, through assumptions, through the assumption that because someone isn't impressive in obvious ways, they must not be impressive at all. So here's what I want you to take away from this story. Look at the people around you. Really look at them. Past the surface, past the job title, or the bank account, or the clothes they wear. Recognize the sacrifices they're making. Honor the choices they've made. Respect the lives they're building, even if those lives don't match the definition of success that society has told you to want. Because the most impressive lives aren't always the ones that look impressive on the outside. Sometimes they're the lives built quietly, patiently, with integrity and humility. And those lives deserve our respect most of all. Bob taught me that, not through words, but through how he lived, through how he continued to show up, to love, to be present, even when the people around him couldn't see his worth. That's a kind of strength that you can't learn in the military. That's a kind of strength that comes from knowing who you are and being okay with that, even when nobody else is.